The voice over the loudspeaker was sharp, brittle, and aimed like a weapon. At Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the busiest travel hub on the planet, noise is a constant. But this voice cut through the background hum of rolling suitcases and muffled announcements, zeroing in on one woman, standing quietly in the boarding line for Transatlantic Airways Flight 88 to London. Dr. Gianna Blake, a woman of impeccable composure and quiet dignity, found herself the sole target of a gate agent's escalating hostility. The agent's smirk promised a public shaming, a demonstration of her absolute authority. She was about to make an example of Gianna. What she didn't know was that in her purse, Gianna carried more than just a passport. She carried a secret that wouldn't just end this confrontation, it would send a shock wave through the entire airline. The air in Concourse E of Hartsfield-Jackson was thick with the familiar airport cocktail of stale air conditioning, overpriced coffee, and the low-grade anxiety of thousands of people in transit. Dr. Gianna Blake stood in the meticulously organized queue for Priority Group 2, her calfskin briefcase resting atop her sleek, regulation-sized roller bag. She was tired, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from a 3-day symposium on aeronautical engineering, where she was the keynote speaker. Her presentation on emerging metal fatigue detection in wide-body aircraft had been a success, but the endless handshaking and intellectual sparring had drained her social battery to zero. All she wanted was to board Flight 788, settle into seat 9A, and lose herself in a technical manual until the plane touched down at Heathrow. Her focus was on the quiet hum of her noise-cancelling headphones when the gate agent's voice, laced with an unnerving cheerfulness that didn't match her cold eyes, first broke through. "Ma'am, ma'am!" Gianna blinked, pulling one earbud out. She looked at the agent, a woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read, Kieran Miller. "I'm sorry, were you speaking to me?" Kieran's smile was a tight, unpleasant line. "I was." "That bag," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Gianna's roller bag. "It looks too large for a carry-on. You'll need to check it." Gianna offered a polite, weary smile. "I can assure you, it's a standard carry-on. I fly with it 3 or 4 times a month. It fits perfectly in the sizer." Kieran's eyes narrowed slightly. She seemed to relish the confrontation, the small stage of the boarding gate, her personal theater of power. "All bags need to be sized today. We're having a crackdown. Please place it in the sizer." Her voice was loud enough for the people nearby to turn and watch. A small spectacle was brewing. Sighing internally, Gianna complied. She lifted her suitcase, a high-end Toomey that she knew for a fact was designed precisely to meet the dimensions of every major airline's sizer, and slid it effortlessly into the blue metal cage. It dropped in with a satisfying thud, with at least an inch to spare on all sides. "See? It fits perfectly," Gianna said, her voice even and calm. A flicker of annoyance crossed Kieran's face, her little power play foiled before it even began. But she wasn't done. "Fine. But you have 2 items. Your briefcase counts as a personal item, but it looks awfully large. The combined weight might be an issue." This was absurd. Transatlantic Airways had no carry-on weight limit for transatlantic business class, which Gianna was flying. Before Gianna could even point this out, Kieran was already moving on, her gaze sweeping over Gianna's attire, a tailored navy pantsuit, practical but elegant. It was a look that screamed professional competence, yet Kieran's eyes held a dismissive, almost contemptuous glint. Gianna felt a familiar, weary pang. It was the random scrutiny that wasn't random at all. She'd felt it her whole life, in different forms. The extra questions at customs, The surprised look when she introduced herself as Dr. Blake. The assumption that she must be in the wrong line, the wrong seat, the wrong profession. "Ma'am, I am flying in business class. There is no combined weight limit for carry-on luggage," Gianna stated, not as a question, but as a fact. She kept her tone professional, refusing to give the woman the emotional reaction she was clearly seeking. Kieran's fake smile faltered, replaced by a sneer. "Oh, you're in business class?" She said it with a dripping sarcasm that implied Gianna couldn't possibly belong there. She snatched the boarding pass from Gianna's hand, her eyes scanning it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Blake. Gianna. Seat 9A. She handed it back with a flick of her wrist. "Well, isn't that nice? Still, policy is policy, and I'm the one who enforces it here." The man behind Gianna, a portly businessman in a wrinkled suit, huffed impatiently. "For God's sake, her bag fits. Let's get this show on the road." Kieran shot him a venomous look before turning her full attention back to Gianna. It was personal now. The other passengers in line began to shift uncomfortably. Some looked at the floor, others watched with undisguised curiosity. Gianna felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She was a private person, a scientist who dealt in facts and figures, not public scenes. "I need you to step out of the line, please," Kieran said, her voice now hard and authoritative. "We need to have a little discussion about your attitude." Gianna stood her ground, her composure a mask of steel over a growing well of indignation. "My attitude? I've done nothing but comply with your requests, even the ones that are contrary to your airline's own policies." "That's it!" Kieran snapped, her face flushing with anger. "You're being disruptive. You're a security risk." The words hung in the air, ludicrous and venomous. Security risk. Gianna, who had dedicated her entire career to improving aviation security and safety. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. "This is completely unprofessional," Gianna said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, I'll show you unprofessional," Kieran retorted, picking up the phone at her podium. "I'm calling airport security. We'll see how you like being escorted out of the terminal. Maybe you'll miss your important business-class flight." A collective gasp went through the line. The situation had spiraled from a petty annoyance into a full-blown, humiliating public confrontation. Gianna watched, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a profound sense of disappointment as Kieran Miller spoke into the phone, her eyes locked on Gianna with triumphant malice. The show was about to begin. The call to security was a declaration of war. In the tightly controlled environment of an airport, those words were a trigger, transforming a customer service dispute into a matter of federal importance. The atmosphere at Gate E14 shifted instantly. The low murmur of conversation died down, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Passengers craned their necks, their faces a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled judgment. Gianna Blake remained preternaturally still, her briefcase and roller bag standing beside her like loyal soldiers. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind. This was no longer about a suitcase or an aggressive gate agent. It was about public humiliation. It was about a woman, Kieran Miller, using the color of Gianna's skin as a canvas on which to paint her own narrative of suspicion and threat. Gianna had seen this script play out before, but never with her as the lead. "You've made a very serious mistake," Gianna said, her voice low and steady, cutting through the silence. It wasn't a threat, but a statement of fact, delivered with the dispassionate clarity of a physicist explaining a law of nature. Kieran scoffed, placing the phone back in its cradle with a clatter. The only one who's made a mistake here is you, sweetie. You should have just checked your bag when I told you to. Now you have to deal with the consequences." She crossed her arms, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered on her face. She was the queen of this little kingdom of linoleum and fluorescent lighting, and she had just banished a dissenter. Gianna watched her, not with anger, but with a clinical sort of fascination. She saw a woman whose only power came from a uniform and a rule book she could bend and twist to her will. A woman who saw a black professional in business class and experienced a cognitive dissonance so profound it could only manifest as hostility. From down the concourse, two figures in the dark blue uniforms of the Atlanta Police Department Airport Division appeared, their walk purposeful. They were accompanied by a man in a black polo shirt with ATL security embroidered on the chest. The trio moved with an practiced, imposing calm that immediately drew every eye. "Is this the individual?" one of the officers, a tall man with a weary expression, asked Kieran, gesturing vaguely toward Gianna. "Yes, officer," Kieran said, her voice taking on a new, performative tone of a victimized employee just trying to do her job. "This passenger became belligerent when I asked her to comply with our baggage policy. She was loud, disruptive, and I believe she poses a security risk to the flight. She refused to leave the boarding area when I instructed her to." It was a masterful work of fiction, each word a carefully chosen barb, designed to paint Gianna as an unhinged aggressor. Gianna felt the stares of the other passengers, some of whom were now likely believing Kieran's version of events. In this situation, the uniform held the power, the airport employee the initial credibility. The officer turned to Gianna. His partner stood slightly behind him, hand resting casually on his belt near his sidearm. The posture was standard, but in this context, it felt menacing. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Peterson. We've received a report of a disturbance. Can you tell me what happened?" His tone was neutral, but the weight of the situation was clear. He was here to remove a problem, and Kieran had already defined Gianna as that problem. Gianna took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying herself. She knew that any sign of agitation, any hint of the righteous fury boiling in her chest would be used against her. She had to be calmer, more rational, and more precise than anyone else in the terminal. "Officer," she began, her voice the epitome of composure. "My name is Dr. Gianna Blake. This gate agent, Ms. Miller, took issue with my carry-on luggage. I demonstrated that it fit the sizer. She then questioned my presence in the business class line and invented a weight policy that does not exist for this airline. When I corrected her, calmly and factually, she accused me of having an attitude and called you. At no point was I belligerent, loud, or disruptive. In fact, several other passengers can attest to that." She glanced briefly at the man in the wrinkled suit who had spoken up for her earlier. He met her gaze for a second before quickly looking away, suddenly unwilling to be drawn into a confrontation with police. Gianna felt a sharp sting of disappointment. He knew the truth, but fear of inconvenience was a powerful silencer. Officer Peterson's eyes flicked from Gianna to Kieran, a hint of uncertainty in his gaze. This wasn't the hysterical screaming passenger he was likely expecting. This was a poised, articulate woman who sounded more like a lawyer than a troublemaker. Kieran, sensing the shift, jumped in. "She's lying. She was completely out of control. I felt threatened. The safety of my crew and the other passengers is my primary concern. I want her removed from the gate area. She is not getting on this flight." This was the point of no return. Kieran had invoked the magic words, threatened and safety. In a post-9/11 airport, those words gave her almost unlimited power. The officers were now obligated to act on her assessment. Officer Peterson's face hardened. His job was to de-escalate and remove threats, real or perceived. The gate agent had perceived one. "Ma'am," he said to Gianna, his voice now firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. We can sort this out away from the gate." "Sort what out?" Gianna asked, a dangerous edge finally creeping into her voice. "Being removed from a flight I paid for, based on the lies of an employee on a power trip. I have done absolutely nothing wrong." "That may be, but we need to clear the area so this flight can board," the officer said, taking a half step toward her. "Please, don't make this more difficult." Gianna looked around. At the faces in the crowd, the unblinking eye of a security camera, the impatient posture of the police. She saw Kieran's triumphant sneer. She had been pushed into a corner, publicly branded a threat, and was about to be escorted away like a common criminal. Politeness had failed. Logic had failed. Reason had been dismissed. She had one card left to play. It was a card she never used, one she kept so deeply hidden it was almost a secret. But Kieran Miller, in her blind prejudice, had forced her hand. "Very well," Gianna said, her voice resonating with a sudden, chilling authority. She reached into her briefcase, her movements slow and deliberate. The second officer tensed slightly, his hand moving closer to his weapon. Kieran watched, a look of vindicated glee on her face. "See, who knows what she has in there?" Gianna ignored her. Her fingers found the smooth leather of her credentials wallet. She pulled it out, flipped it open, and held it up for Officer Peterson to see. It wasn't a driver's license or a passport. It was a dark blue credential, emblazoned with a gold seal. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Federal Aviation Administration." And beneath her photograph, her name, Dr. Gianna Blake, was her title, Senior Air Safety Investigator. The world seemed to stop. The low hum of the concourse, the distant rumble of a taxiing jet, the anxious shuffling of the passengers in line, it all faded into a deafening silence. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the small leather wallet in Dr. Gianna Blake's hand. Officer Peterson's eyes, which had been hard with professional resolve, widened in disbelief. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on the gold seal of the FAA. He read the title, Senior Air Safety Investigator, once, then twice, as if the words were in a foreign language. His entire posture changed, the authoritative stance dissolved, replaced by a sudden, rigid deference. His partner, seeing the look on his face, took a step back, his own expression one of dawning alarm. Kieran Miller, who had been preening in her victory, craned her neck to see what had caused the sudden shift. She saw the credential, but the letters FAA didn't immediately register. "What is that? Some kind of fake ID?" she sneered, her arrogance momentarily blinding her to the gravity of the situation. "Ma'am," Officer Peterson said, his voice now directed at Kieran, but his eyes still locked on Gianna's badge. "Be quiet." It was not a request. It was a command, sharp and absolute. He then turned back to Gianna, his tone transformed. "Dr. Blake," he said, the title now spoken with an emphasis that bordered on reverence. "My apologies. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Gianna didn't lower the badge. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "There has been no misunderstanding, officer. There has been a gross abuse of authority by this airline employee. She has fabricated a security threat, profiled a passenger, and wasted the resources of your department. Every word was precise, delivered with the weight of the federal agency her badge represented. The FAA wasn't just some abstract government body. In the world of aviation, they were the ultimate authority. They wrote the rules. They certified the planes. They investigated the crashes. An FAA senior air safety investigator was not someone to be trifled with. They were the people who could ground fleets, levy million-dollar fines, and end careers with the stroke of a pen. Kieran finally processed the significance of the letters FAA. The blood drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of horror. The smirk was gone, replaced by the dawning, sickening realization of what she had done. She hadn't just bullied a random passenger. She had attempted to have a federal aviation official arrested at her own gate. The silence in the terminal was now so profound it felt heavy, pressing in on everyone. The other passengers, who had been watching a simple drama unfold, now understood they were witnessing a cataclysm. The businessman who had looked away earlier was now staring, his mouth agape. A young woman in the back of the line had her phone out, discreetly recording the entire scene. "Dr. Blake," the officer repeated, "what would you like us to do?" The question hung in the air, a stunning reversal of power. A moment ago, she was the suspect about to be escorted away. Now, she was the authority in charge. Before Gianna could answer, a man in a crisp Transatlantic Airways manager's suit came rushing toward the gate, his tie askew and a frantic look in his eyes. He had clearly been summoned by a panicked call from another gate agent who had witnessed the meltdown. His name tag read, "David Chen, Station Manager." "What is going on here?" he demanded, trying to project authority, but his eyes darted nervously between the police officers and the stone-faced Gianna. Kieran turned to him, her voice a desperate, trembling whisper. "David, this woman, she was being disruptive." David Chen ignored her completely. His eyes had found the FAA badge, still held firmly in Gianna's hand. His professional composure shattered, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He knew exactly what that badge meant. It meant federal oversight. It meant official reports. It meant a world of trouble he was not prepared for on a Tuesday afternoon. "Dr. Blake," he stammered, reading her name from the credential. "I am so sorry. I am David Chen, the station manager for Transatlantic Airways here in Atlanta. Please, whatever the issue is, I can assure you we will resolve it immediately." Gianna finally lowered her hand, snapping the leather wallet shut with a soft, final click. The sound was like a gavel falling. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice cold as the stratosphere, "your employee, Ms. Miller, has created a situation that goes far beyond a simple customer service issue. She has, without cause, identified a passenger as a security threat, lied to law enforcement, and attempted to deny me boarding, based on what I can only assume are her own personal prejudices." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. She looked from David Chen's terrified face to Kieran Miller's ashen one. "This is no longer just about me missing my flight. This is now an official matter. I will be filing a formal report with my agency regarding the conduct of your staff and the potential for discriminatory practices within your airline's ground operations." The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. Gianna Blake had not raised her voice. She had not screamed or cried. She had simply stated the facts, and in doing so, she had silenced everyone. The gate agent, the police, the manager, the 100 or so passengers, all of them stood frozen, witnesses to a complete and devastating shift in the universe of Gate E14. The power trip was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The frantic energy that erupted in the wake of Gianna's declaration was a sight to behold. David Chen, the station manager, looked as if he was trying to simultaneously defuse a bomb and put out a fire. "Ms. Miller, go to the back office. Now," he hissed, his voice a low, panicked whisper. He didn't even look at her. His entire focus was on Gianna, his expression a desperate plea for mercy. "Kieran, stripped of her authority and her arrogance, scurried away without a word, her face a crumpled mask of fear. She disappeared through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," a silent, ignominious exit from the stage she had so eagerly commanded just minutes before. "Dr. Blake, please," David began, his hands fluttering nervously. "Let me personally escort you onto the aircraft. Your seat is waiting. We can get you a drink, anything you need. We can discuss this. Please don't let this incident reflect on our entire airline." Gianna looked at the police officers. "Thank you for your time, officers. You may stand down. I will be handling this through official channels." Officer Peterson nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. "Yes, ma'am. Of course. We'll be on our way." He and his partner practically melted back into the concourse, eager to be as far away from the situation as possible. The boarding process, which had been frozen in time, restarted with a flustered urgency. A new gate agent, a young man with wide, terrified eyes, began scanning boarding passes, his hands trembling slightly. Every passenger who walked past Gianna either stared in awe or meticulously avoided eye contact, as if she were a celestial body with its own gravitational pull. "Mr. Chen," Gianna said, her composure unwavering, "I will be boarding my flight, but this conversation is not over. Not by a long shot." David Chen personally escorted her down the jet bridge, apologizing profusely with every step. He took her roller bag, handled her briefcase with the care one might afford to a priceless artifact, and showed her to seat 9A in the quiet, hushed cabin of business class. "Is there anything at all I can get for you, Dr. Blake?" The lead flight attendant, already briefed on the situation, asked with a strained but professional smile. "No, thank you," Gianna said, sinking into the plush leather seat. "I'd just like to be left alone." As the cabin door was sealed and the plane began its slow pushback from the gate, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally began to recede, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its place. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt profoundly weary and saddened. She stared out the small oval window as the ground crew scurried below and the concrete expanse of Hartsfield-Jackson slid by. She hadn't wanted to use her badge. In her 12 years with the FAA, she had never once used her credentials for personal leverage. Her position was a sacred trust, a tool for ensuring the safety of millions of travelers, not a trump card to win an argument. But Kieran Miller had left her no choice. She had been backed into a corner where her word, her professional standing, her very presence were deemed worthless until proven otherwise by a piece of government-issued identification. The incident had scraped away the polite veneer of society and exposed the ugly, raw prejudice that still festered beneath. The flight to London was smooth, the service in the business class cabin impeccable to the point of being obsequious. The flight attendants treated her with a cautious, reverent distance. David Chen had clearly communicated the gravity of the situation to the crew. She was not just a passenger anymore. She was a federal investigator who had been wronged. Gianna barely touched her meal. She opened her laptop, but instead of reviewing the schematics for a new landing gear assembly, she opened a blank document. She began to write. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her prose as precise and emotionless as a technical report. She detailed the entire encounter, from the initial challenge over her luggage to the fabricated security threat. She noted the time, the flight number, the gate, and the names of the employees involved. She described Kieran Miller's tone, her words, her escalating hostility. She described the reactions of the other passengers, the arrival of the police, and the utter transformation in their demeanor upon seeing her credentials. She was not writing as a wronged passenger seeking an apology or a voucher. She was writing as Senior Air Safety Investigator Blake, documenting a potential systemic failure. Gate agents held a critical role in the aviation security chain. They were the last line of defense before the sterile area of the aircraft. An agent who was unstable, prejudiced, and willing to lie to law enforcement was not just a customer service problem. They were a safety liability. What if, in her haste to target someone she disliked, she missed a real threat? What if her poor judgment extended to other critical aspects of her job? By the time the plane was cruising at 30,000 feet over the dark Atlantic, Gianna had a 6-page, single-spaced document drafted. It was a meticulous, damning account. When she landed at Heathrow, she would encrypt it and send it not to Transatlantic Airways Customer Service Department, but to her own director at the FAA and to the agency's Office of Civil Rights. The karma that was coming for Kieran Miller and Transatlantic Airways wouldn't be a simple reprimand or a forced apology. It would be cold, procedural, and bureaucratic. It would come in the form of official inquiries, mandated reviews, and the full, crushing weight of federal oversight. Gianna closed her laptop, the soft glow of the screen vanishing in the darkened cabin. She leaned her head back against the seat. The low drone of the Rolls-Royce engines a familiar lullaby. The battle at the gate was over, but the war for accountability had just begun. The email landed in the inbox of Robert Maxwell, the CEO of Transatlantic Airways, with all the subtlety of a bird strike. It wasn't from Dr. Gianna Blake herself. It was from the office of the FAA's Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety. The subject line was stark and unadorned. Formal complaint and request for investigation regarding TAA personnel at ATL. Maxwell, a man accustomed to glowing profit reports and fawning industry press, felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach as he read the attached letter and Gianna's meticulously detailed report. He read it once, then a second time, the color draining from his face. This wasn't a disgruntled passenger on social media. This was a high-ranking federal official from the very agency that held his airline's fate in its hands. Within the hour, an emergency meeting was convened via secure video conference. On the call were the airline's chief operating officer, the head of North American operations, the vice president of human resources, and a very grim-faced team of corporate lawyers. David Chen, the Atlanta station manager, was patched in, his voice trembling as he recounted the events. She was calm, professional, even after everything, Chen reported, sweat beading on his forehead. When I saw that badge, I knew this was going to be bad. The head of North American operations, a gruff man named George Findlay, slammed his fist on his desk. One gate agent, one power-tripping idiot is going to bring federal heat down on our entire operation. Find out everything there is to know about this Kieran Miller. I want her entire service record on my desk an hour ago. The machinery of corporate damage control ground into motion with ruthless efficiency. The HR department pulled Kieran Miller's file. What they found was not surprising, but it was damning. Over her 12-year career with TAA, Miller had accumulated 19 passenger complaints. 11 of them involved accusations of rudeness. 5 alleged discriminatory behavior, though they were all vaguely worded and had been dismissed by previous managers as unsubstantiated. The pattern was undeniable. Kieran Miller was a liability they had failed to address for over a decade. She was immediately placed on unpaid administrative leave, her airport access credentials revoked pending the outcome of the investigation. Her union representative was notified, but even he sounded grim on the phone. Lying to law enforcement and fabricating a security threat against a federal agent wasn't something the union could easily defend. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Gianna's report was having its own seismic effect. It was flagged by the Office of Civil Rights as a Priority 1 incident. The FAA didn't just see this as a case of a misbehaving employee. They saw it as a potential symptom of a diseased corporate culture at Transatlantic Airways. Was this an isolated event? Or was TAA's training so deficient that its employees felt empowered to act with such blatant prejudice? The FAA's official inquiry began. They requested TAA provide all documents related to the incident, including security camera footage from Gate E14, Kieran Miller's complete employment and disciplinary history, and copies of the airline's current anti-discrimination and de-escalation training manuals. The video footage was the nail in the coffin. The silent, grainy images from the overhead camera perfectly corroborated Gianna's account. It showed her calm demeanor, her suitcase sliding easily into the sizer, and Kieran Miller's increasingly agitated and aggressive posturing. There was no audio, but the visuals told the whole story. Gianna stood like a statue of composure, while Kieran gesticulated wildly, culminating in her grabbing the phone to call security. Just as the internal investigation at TAA was gaining steam, another piece of evidence surfaced. The young woman who had been filming the encounter on her phone, a law student named Sarah Jenkins, saw a news report about airlines facing increased scrutiny over passenger rights. Realizing the significance of what she had witnessed, she contacted a well-known aviation blogger. She sent him the 45-second video clip she had taken. It started just as Kieran was screaming, "Security risk," and ended with the stunned silence after Gianna presented her badge. The blogger, Brendan O'Connell, ran a popular site called Wingtips and Grievances. He knew a bombshell when he saw one. He verified the details, wrote a scathing article under the headline, "TAA Gate Agent Tries to Arrest Passenger, Discovers She's the FAA," and posted the video. It went viral overnight. By the time Robert Maxwell woke up the next morning, the story was on every major news network. An FAA jade was trending on Twitter. The stock price of Transatlantic Airways had dipped 4% in pre-market trading. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict, and it was brutal. The incident was no longer a quiet, internal matter to be handled with carefully worded apologies. It was a full-blown public relations catastrophe. The hard karma Gianna had set in motion was no longer just a slow-moving federal investigation. It had become a raging inferno, and Transatlantic Airways was standing right at the center of the blaze. For Kieran Miller, the world did not end with a bang, but with a text message. It arrived on a Wednesday morning while she was watering her petunias, still cloaked in a fragile bubble of self-righteous indignation. It was from a neighbor, a woman she'd only ever exchanged pleasantries with. The message contained a single hyperlink, followed by 3 words. "Is this you?" Curiosity piqued, Kieran tapped the link. A video loaded on her phone screen. The footage was shaky, clearly filmed by an amateur, but the scene was unmistakable. It was Gate E14, and there she was, her face contorted in a sneer she didn't recognize as her own. She heard her own voice, shrill and sharp, screeching the words, "Security risk." She watched the calm, elegant woman in the navy pantsuit, a figure of infuriating composure. Then came the moment that had haunted her sleep, the reveal of the FAA badge, the sudden, deathly silence, and the look of pure horror that had dawned on her own face. Her first instinct was denial. "They cut it to make me look bad," she muttered to the empty kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. They didn't show how she was provoking me, how arrogant she was. Then she made a fateful mistake. She scrolled down to the comment section. It was a digital guillotine. Thousands of messages from thousands of strangers, each one a slice at her soul. Kieran Miller is the final boss of all Kierans. The smirk on her face when she thinks she's won, then the moment her soul leaves her body. Priceless. This isn't a power trip. This is racism, pure and simple. Fire her. Revoke her airport clearance for life. Her full name was everywhere. They had found her. The digital mob, with its terrifying crowdsourced efficiency, was tearing her life apart, pixel by pixel. She slammed the phone face down on the counter, her hands shaking. But the damage was done. The world now knew her, not as Kieran Miller, a diligent airline employee, but as a viral villain in a 45-second morality play. The official execution of her career arrived a week later, not via an email or a phone call, but with the cold formality of a certified letter. The slip in her mailbox felt like a summons. She drove to the post office with a knot of dread in her stomach and signed for the crisp TAA envelope. Back in her car, she tore it open. The language was sterile, devoid of any human emotion, which somehow made it crueler. Termination of your employment, effective immediately. Gross misconduct and actions detrimental to the reputation and operational integrity of Transatlantic Airways. Breach of security protocols and misrepresentation of facts to law enforcement officials. 12 years of service, of early mornings and holiday shifts, of dealing with irate and intoxicated passengers, all erased by a few paragraphs of legalese. She was no longer just suspended. She was an outcast. Her attempts to re-enter the workforce were a masterclass in humiliation. The viral video was a digital tattoo on her forehead. At an interview for an administrative assistant position at a local logistics company, the hiring manager's friendly demeanor froze midway through her resume. He had recognized her. The rest of the interview was a clipped, awkward formality before the inevitable. "We'll be in touch." He never was. She applied for a stockroom position at a large retail store, thinking her face would be less of a liability away from customers. The manager, a young man half her age, looked up from her application, then at her face, and back down again. "I'm sorry," he said, not unkindly. "I just don't think you'd be the right fit for our team." Her world, once defined by the sprawling, anonymous crowds of the airport, had become small and suffocating. The neighbor who sent the link now hurried inside her house when Kieran's car pulled into the driveway. Friends from work stopped returning her texts. The harassment was a low, constant hum of misery. Pizzas she never ordered arrived at 2 a.m. Her email inbox filled with threats. She had to change her number and delete every social media profile, effectively erasing her own identity to escape the caricature she had become. The final, most devastating blow came from a law firm representing TAA's insurance underwriters. They summoned her for a deposition. She wasn't being sued, the lawyer explained, but her testimony was critical to the airline's mitigation strategy with the FAA. The law office was a cathedral of corporate power, all dark wood and brushed steel, with a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The lawyer, a man named Benjamin Carter with cold eyes and an impeccably tailored suit, offered her a water she was too nervous to drink. He wasn't there to help her. He was there to professionally dismantle her. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice calm and measured, "we have your entire service record here. 19 passenger complaints over 12 years. 5 of those allege discriminatory conduct. Can you help me understand this pattern?" Kieran tried to build her defense, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a stressful job. People don't like being told what to do. You have to be firm. I was just enforcing the rules." "The rules?" Carter countered, sliding a printed copy of the TAA carry-on policy across the polished table. He tapped a highlighted section. "There is no weight limit for business class carry-ons. You invented that rule. Why?" I thought her bags looked heavy." "You thought?" Carter pressed, his voice losing its gentle edge. Or did you take issue with Dr. Blake herself? Let's talk about your next rule. You claimed her bag was too large. Security footage shows it fit into the sizer with room to spare. Yet you continued to escalate. Why? She had an attitude, Kieran said, the words sounding weak and childish even to her own ears. She was condescending. She acted like she was better than me. Carter leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. And you decided in that moment that your job was to teach her a lesson, to humiliate her? Is that also in the TAA employee handbook? He didn't wait for an answer. You lied to federal law enforcement, Ms. Miller. The video shows Dr. Blake standing perfectly still, yet you told the officers she was out of control. You said you felt threatened. Did she ever raise her voice? Did she make a single aggressive move toward you? No, but Kieran's defense crumbled into dust. The justifications that had seemed so solid in her own mind were revealed as nothing more than flimsy excuses for a profound personal failing. Carter sat back, a look of clinical finality on his face. You see, Ms. Miller, my job is to protect Transatlantic Airways from the consequences of this incident. And the most effective way to do that is to demonstrate to the FAA that the company's robust policies were flagrantly violated by a single employee acting unpredictably and irrationally out of personal animus. That employee is you. You are not a victim of a difficult passenger. You were the sole aggressor. The truth of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just the scapegoat. She was the story the airline was going to tell to save itself. She was the cancer they were cutting out to prove the rest of the body was healthy. She walked out of the law office into the bright afternoon sun, feeling hollowed out. The city bustled around her, a world moving on without her. The hard karma she was experiencing wasn't a lightning strike of retribution. It was a slow, grinding erosion of everything she had ever been, a public shaming followed by a quiet, lonely erasure. She had tried to strip a woman of her dignity for a few minutes at a boarding gate, and in return, the world had stripped her of her entire life. The fallout for Transatlantic Airways was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, crushing avalanche. In the pristine, soundproofed boardroom on the top floor of TAA Tower, the mood was funereal. CEO Robert Maxwell stood before a massive oak table, the faces of his executive board staring back at him, some in person, others as grim-faced holograms on the video conference screen. The viral video played on a loop on a massive monitor behind him, the audio muted, but Kieran Miller's furious gestures and Gianna Blake's chilling composure needed no sound to convey the disaster. This is not a social media flare-up we can manage with a press release and a few thousand flight vouchers, Maxwell began, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. This is the Federal Aviation Administration. The report from Dr. Blake's office is not an accusation. It's an indictment. They see the actions of Ms. Miller not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of a corporate disease. They are questioning our fitness to operate. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The COO, George Findlay, who had demanded Kieran's file just weeks before, looked pale. We terminated her. We offered our unreserved apology. What more can they possibly want? They want repentance, the airline's lead counsel interjected, her voice sharp. And in the language of the federal government, repentance is spelled REFORM. They are talking about mandated operational oversight. They want to get under the hood of this company and rewire it. This is existential. Meanwhile, in her quiet Washington, D.C. office overlooking the Potomac, Gianna Blake was focused on a new report detailing stress corrosion cracking in the turbine blades of a specific jet engine. She received updates on the TAA investigation, through official channels, reading the summaries with the dispassionate eye of a scientist observing data. There was no sense of triumph, no personal glee in the corporate panic she had unleashed. Her goal had never been personal revenge against Kieran Miller. A person was just a single, faulty component. The real issue was the machine itself. In her world of aeronautics, a hidden weakness, a microscopic crack, could go unnoticed for years until the right combination of stress and pressure caused a catastrophic failure. She viewed the corporate culture at Transatlantic Airways in the same way. Kieran Miller wasn't the crack. She was merely the first sign of a deep, structural fatigue in the airline's ethical framework. The system had failed, and now the system had to be fixed. The settlement negotiations were brutal. TAA's legal team, accustomed to dealing with civil suits, tried to negotiate the terms down, to treat the fine as a cost of doing business. But they were not dealing with another corporation. They were dealing with their regulator. The FAA representatives were unyielding. They made it clear that the financial penalty was the least of TAA's concerns. "The fine is punitive," the lead FAA counsel stated in a stone-cold video call. "The reforms are corrective. They are not negotiable." Faced with the threat of having their routes audited, their security protocols put under federal review, and a public relations nightmare that was costing them millions a day in bookings, TAA capitulated completely. The consent decree they signed was a landmark in airline industry regulation. First, the public apology from Robert Maxwell was broadcast live, a humbling act of corporate contrition. The initial fine of $1.5 million was wired to the Treasury, a stark reminder of their failure. But the core of the decree was the institutional overhaul. TAA was mandated to scrap its entire customer service training program. When the FAA asked for recommendations on consulting firms specializing in corporate cultural change, Gianna's boss, knowing her deep expertise, had quietly asked for her input. She provided a short list of the industry's most respected firms, ensuring the process would be guided by true experts, not just corporate box checkers. The firm they hired created the Dignity at the Gate initiative. It was a sea change. The flimsy 45-minute online module was replaced by a mandatory 3-day, in-person training seminar for every single customer-facing employee, from the newest hire to the most senior station manager. The resistance was palpable at first. Veteran agents sat with their arms crossed, viewing it as a punishment for one person's mistake. That changed on the first day. The facilitator, a sharp-witted woman with a background in organizational psychology, played the security footage from Gate E14. "Forget who was right or wrong for a moment," she said, pausing the video on Kieran Miller's angry face. "Let's talk about control. At what point did our employee lose it? And at what point did that loss of control create a safety liability for our airline?" She walked them through the encounter, frame by frame. They discussed the unconscious bias that might lead an agent to question a black woman's presence in a priority line. They role-played de-escalation techniques, learning to listen to a passenger's frustration instead of just reacting to their anger. The anonymized ATL incident became a powerful, cautionary tale, a lesson in how ego and prejudice have no place on the sterile side of an airport. The final piece of the settlement was the creation of a new, independent passenger complaint review board. No longer could a manager simply dismiss a claim of discrimination. Every such complaint was now automatically escalated to this board, which had the power to override managers and mandate disciplinary action. Accountability was no longer optional. Gianna never spoke to Kieran Miller again. She read in a news summary that Miller had sold her home and moved to a different state, unable to find work in Georgia. Gianna felt a brief, faint pang of something akin to pity, but it was fleeting. The consequences were the natural result of choices made. About a year later, Gianna found herself in Chicago O'Hare, waiting for a connecting flight home. It was a cold, blustery evening, and delays were rippling through the system. A man in front of her at the gate, a TAA gate, was growing increasingly agitated. "What do you mean it's cancelled?" he demanded, his voice rising. "My daughter's recital is tomorrow. I promised her I'd be there." Gianna tensed, a ghost of the Atlanta concourse rising in her memory. She watched the gate agent, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. He didn't rise to the anger. He held up a calming hand and made eye contact. "Sir, I completely understand your frustration. A promise to your daughter is the most important thing in the world," he said, his voice laced with genuine empathy. "The weather has shut down the eastern corridor, but let's not give up. Let me look at our partner airlines. There might be a flight we can get you on through Dallas. It's not ideal, but it will get you there in time. Let's solve this together." The passenger's anger visibly deflated, replaced by a flicker of hope. "You can do that?" "I can certainly try," the agent said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. Gianna stood back, watching the quiet, respectful collaboration. This was it. This was the change. It wasn't a headline or a press release. It was a simple, human interaction at a gate on a stormy night. It was the system working as it should, not because of fear, but because of a new, better instilled principle of service. The ripple effect of that awful day in Atlanta had reached this gate in Chicago. A genuine, unburdened smile touched her lips. The turbulence had passed. The structural fatigue had been repaired. The sky ahead, for countless passengers who would never know her name or her story, was just a little bit safer and a little more clear. That single, tense moment at the departure gate wasn't just about one woman's prejudice or another's powerful secret. It was a reflection of a much larger struggle for dignity and respect. The story of Dr. Gianna Blake and Kieran Miller shows us that true justice, true karma, isn't always loud and explosive. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and systemic. It's not just about one person getting fired. It's about changing the very system that allowed them to cause harm in the first place. Gianna's stand didn't just win her an apology, it forced an entire corporation to look in the mirror and become better, setting a new standard for an entire industry. Her courage created a ripple effect that will benefit countless travelers for years to come. If this story about accountability and profound consequences resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who believes in standing up for what's right, and subscribe for more real-life stories where justice finds a way. And let us know in the comments, what do you think was the most powerful moment of karma in this story? We'd love to hear from you.